Hi everyone, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Climate Change and Mental Health webinar. My name is Lauren Thomas and I'm CPD Program Officer with Central and Eastern Sydney PHN. I would first like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians and sovereign people of the land across which we work, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be joining us tonight. So at the end of the webinar, the evaluation survey will pop up in the chat and in your browser once I've ended the webinar. This will allow us to send certificates of attendance, so we really appreciate your feedback. Tonight's event is a self-report activity for any GPs who might be joining us. And if you have a question for Louise, if you could please pop them in the Q&A box and they'll be answered at the end of the presentation. I would also now like to draw your attention to some upcoming events. So if you'd like to register for any of those, can you please do that via the QR code, and that will take you to our website. I also just wanted to mention our Green Practice checklist, which is for general practices and allied health services. So this checklist is a self-audit tool that provides an environmental assessment of your workplace. It takes no more than 10 minutes to complete and will recognise your green achievements and identify ways that you could make your practice more sustainable. The link is in the QR code on the screen. So if the checklist is designed to benefit your patients, your practice, and ensure your business aligns with best practice green principles. I would now like to introduce my colleague Kylie Somerville, who will be facilitating the Q&A, and she's the Manager of Strategic Projects at CESPN. And we also have Dr. Brendan Goodjar, who is the General Manager of Primary Care Improvement at CESPN, who's also online tonight. Thank you, Kylie.
Thanks, everyone, and welcome. I'd just like to introduce our speaker for tonight, who is Louise Shepherd. Louise is a clinical psychologist with 25 years' experience in individuals and groups in a variety of settings. Her clinical training was based in traditional CBT with a strong background in treating anxiety and mood disorders. For the last 15 years, Louise has predominantly used acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and in 2012, she set up the Sydney ACT Centre, which ran until 2023. Since 2014, Louise has also worked part-time as an executive coach, working with individuals and teams. Louise has trained extensively in ACT, both here and overseas. She's recognised as an Association for Contextual Behaviour Science peer-reviewed ACT trainer and member of the International ACT training community. In 2023, following a break from clinical practice, Louise decided to pivot in a new direction, focusing on behaviour change work for the planet. In 2023, Louise worked part-time for an independent federal MP, leading a project to decarbonise an urban electorate, and is writing a book on imperfect climate action without the shame and blame, using her clinical knowledge and personal experiences. Please welcome Louise.
Oh gosh, thank you. Next time I'll send something much shorter so you don't have to get through all that. I'm so sorry, Kylie. Maybe all I really need to say is that professionally and personally, I care a lot about climate action. That's probably enough to say why I'm here, and probably why many of you are here as well. So really lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me back. I did a similar talk last year. I'm guessing that my slides are now up. Just only let me know if they're not, but I'll get going. Okay, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians. I'm in Sydney, in Wallumattagal country, around Gladesville, Hunters Hill area. So I'd also just like to recognise where I am this evening. Okay, so why are we here? So I'm guessing that you're here because either personally or professionally with clients, patients. If I jumble that up, I know we have a mix of allied health and GPs and other staff. So, you know, I probably will use those terms a little bit interchangeably. I generally use the word clients, but I know that many of you will refer to patients. So whatever you use. we're here because it's an existential crisis. It's something that's impacting on all of our lives, and it's something we really can't ignore. These are some of the things that I'm going to talk about in the next sort of 45 minutes. Okay. This is my puppy who's asleep beside me. Um, I just really want to be clear that because the topic is it can be quite an emotional one, there might be things that trigger some emotions. I think as long as you have puppies, a cup of tea or some chocolate or something or someone that you can hug after the presentation, please just do take care of yourself, because it is a topic that can be hard to talk about and hard to face. And in fact, many people tell me that they've put off learning about climate change for a long time just because it was actually something that they thought would be too heavy to learn about. These are actually some pictures of where I grew up. The photo in the boat is actually my dear dad and one of his best mates during a flood on the river, and the other two photos show things sort of getting very dangerously close. It did actually flood twice when I was a kid. Um, but whilst I don't remember that, it was actually a couple of days off school for me. I guess floods is something that my family has certainly lived with over the years, and many people obviously these days will have been face to face with floods, bushfires, and other extreme weather events. I'd just like to read a poem that I came across last week. It was I forget what the competition was called, but the woman who wrote this was a young person called Aisha Muhammad, and it won a Young Poetry Award, and I've forgotten the name, which is really unkind to her beautiful work. But I'll just read this for you. Our Inheritance. There was a time the winds told stories. My grandfather said you could hear them in the whistle through eucalypts, in the way the crows would answer back. He taught me to read weather like scripture. A hot wind meant lightning, a burnt sky meant ash, and a silence too thick to breathe meant it was already too late. I remember the summer the river turned sour, fish floating like peeled silver in the reeds, my mother not letting me swim. She didn't speak much that season. The garden curled into itself like a fist. At school, we made dioramas of sustainable futures. Mine was cardboard glaciers and cardboard fire. I glued a tiny house at the edge of a cliff and called it home. At night, I dreamed of oceans swallowing the places we never went to, and forests cracking open like skin. We weren't meant to carry this, not the maths of melting, not the graphs shaped like cliff dives, not the guilt of being born on borrowed time. But we do. We carry it in compost bins and protest signs, in poems like this one. We carry it in the awkward hope that someone after us might still learn to listen when the wind tells stories. Ah, powerful stuff, hey? And I can see why it won a prestigious award. I guess what I want to say about what I'll be presenting is that, as with a lot of things in psychology, it depends. So, I might say something, you might be thinking, well, that wouldn't work with my older patient, or that wouldn't work with my younger patient, or whatever it might be. And for any of the allied health professionals, you'll know that often the answer is it depends. And so the cup on the right is my favorite coffee mug, but it's really it's like it's annoying, but it kind of really does depend. My kids were a few years younger than they are now when they first realized that that was something to giggle at. Speaking of which, this is a very old photo of my family at the top, and down the bottom is a photo, I think it was at Malakuta during the 2019-2020 bushfires. And I really just wanted to include that just with the juxtaposition of a day at the beach and what a day at the beach really should look like. It's boogie boards and swimming, catching waves, and really just having fun and getting ice creams. And what a day at the beach was for those people who were stuck along the coastline and who were dealing with bushfires for months on end in parts of Australia. How terrifying it was. And I guess we know that that things are pretty bad. And for many of you, you might already know this, but the hottest 20 years on record have been in the last, I've got to move this, last 22 years, and 2024 was the hottest year on record. A few days ago, we had the hottest October day on record. We just keep breaking record after record. And I guess, you know, there's lots of, unfortunately, that can lead for many of us to want to switch off, to not have to think about things. But really, I think we are getting to a point where we can't actually hide from this. It's just getting harder and harder. That image is of world leaders talking about climate change from a few years ago. Not really, it's an artwork, just to be clear. And again, more images. I think that it was Lismore in the middle up the top there. We've just had lots of things happening that shouldn't be happening, and happening a lot sooner than were predicted to happen. And so we have Antonio Guterres back a year or two ago talking about the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived. I think one of my favorite artists, climate activists, is Jess Harwood. And I think this really sums it up. Like, we can go for days or weeks or months and everything's sort of fine, and then it's not. And for certain communities and for many people, things have been not fine, you know, quite frequently. So they're having event after event that they need to very quickly recover and will not recover, but before they know it, they're facing something else. This actually, I'm pretty sure this is from today, and I'm not actually sure which paper it came from. A friend of mine from Doctors for the Environment actually posted this. But just actually, I'm going to share some things from the report that was actually being discussed in Parliament today or yesterday. So it's very topical. It's something that is getting, getting more and more attention, as it should be. And Dr. Kate Wiley from Doctors for the Environment talks about that climate is making our bodies and our minds sicker. And so that's really what I want to talk to you about, mostly the mind part. But for many of you, you'll also be interested in how our bodies are also being made sicker. And there's plenty of good information out there on that. Look, this is just a model, and I'm going to go through some of this stuff quite quickly because I do want to focus in on some of the things that you can be doing as you sit in a room with someone. And you will have access to these slides. I'm sorry, I don't think I said that earlier, but I believe Lauren will send them out to you tomorrow. But I guess there's lots of different ways that climate change will impact on mental health. And this is going to be both for individuals, it's going to be directly and indirectly. So if parents experience impacts of climate change, then children will also be impacted by those. It might even be intergenerational. If your grandparents live on the South Coast, or as my parents are from the South Coast, or say in the Lismore area or wherever it may be, then the children and the grandchildren are likely to have been impacted and seen the impacts that that's had on their family members and so on. And increasingly what we have is a situation where you don't have to have a direct impact with the extreme weather event. It might just be your awareness, what you're reading, what you're hearing about, people you know who have been impacted, hearing stories and so on, and that can actually also really affect mental health and well-being. So, I always write notes and then I just forget them and I jump around. All right. So some of the eco emotions, and actually there's a couple of nice quotes. So the report that I'm actually looking at, I think has literally been updated in the last few days, and I'll send a link to it, but it is Doctors for the Environment Australia with loads and loads of references, and it's entitled How Climate Change Affects Mental Health in Australia. So it's really just completely on topic. So eco-anxiety, I guess, is the word that we use the most, or we hear the most. It's often in the media, people talk about eco-anxiety. A colleague, I think it was Caroline Hickman in the UK, sort of talks about that really eco-anxiety is a toe in the water. Like, it's not really getting to the heavier stuff, like the grief and so forth, and the trauma and so on. But just to give you a little bit of a definition, so eco-anxiety or eco-distress, you can define as the chronic fear of environmental doom, and it may include a range of anxiety, worry, stress, hopelessness, sleep disturbance, irritability, despair, bodily symptoms of anxiety, such as awareness of heartbeat, butterflies in the stomach, sweaty palms, perceived shortness of breath. And eco-anxiety has been found across the lifespan and may particularly affect young people, and that certainly seems to be the case. 93% of over 10,000 Australians under 30 believe that the government is not doing enough to address climate change. So I don't know that it's there, but one of the things I think that will come up this evening is this idea of betrayal. So it's not just about what's happening to our planet. It's like, why aren't the adults in charge protecting me from these harms? Why aren't the grown-ups doing their job? And that's something that I think, I actually posted that online today, and a woman came back to, and she said, well, I'm 70 and I'm still wondering why the grown-ups and those in charge are not doing. So it's not just our young people who are feeling that. Some of these terms, things like ecological grief is probably not one that's very familiar to many people, or disenfranchised grief might be a term that you're familiar with in other ways, but it's really sort of grief that you're not really almost supposed to have, or it's hard to know where to express it and to whom is it safe to express it. Will I get laughed at? It's going back a few years, but I once told a mum at a kid's birthday party that I was giving a talk on eco-anxiety, and she looked at me straight-faced and then laughed, and she said, "You've got to be joking." And it was actually just really shocking, and I thought, wow, you're clearly not a safe person to discuss these kinds of things with. Solastalgia is really about the longing, or it's like a homesickness you have for changing places. And it might be about the bird life that has changed in a favorite national park. It might be that, you know, people are no longer able to live in the same places. And certainly in countries nearby, islands are, you know, are likely to be disappearing in the coming years. PTSD and pre-TSD, you know, the worrying, the flash forward, so to speak, worrying about things that might be coming. Lots of emotions there. And in a sense, I guess they are like other emotions, but as we'll talk more about, the thing is, I guess, is that it's really understandable why people would be feeling a lot of these things. It's not pathological to be having these emotions. In fact, it makes total sense given the state of the planet. Okay. And I guess, you know, in a sense, like, it hurts to care. So at the same time, we talk about like eco emotions that might be like quite hard to have, like the distress, the grief, the shame, the guilt, the frustration and anger and so forth. Eco-empathy, I guess, is it's almost like you have to have a sense of empathy for, the planet. You don't have to, you might just care about what's happening to your kids or to your soccer games on the weekend or whatever it may be. But I think that for people who get really involved in climate work, eco-empathy is a huge part of that, for the, you know, the beautiful old growth forests, for all of the animals that were killed during the bushfires and so on. So, who might actually need us to be climate aware? I think probably there's a lot of people, but there might be certain groups who might be more susceptible than others. And again, there was a nice summary in here, and I wanted to just make sure that I double check it. I literally came across this report today, so my apologies that I don't know it quite as well as I'd like to. But young people are scared for their future. I recently did some work with Headspace, and they were really wanting to make sure that their young people and teachers and carers especially around the areas such as around Lismore and so forth, that they're getting the support because they've obviously already been through so much and there's more to come. Over 50% are seriously worried. And, some kids, some young people are choosing not to actually reproduce because they don't feel like it's safe enough to be bringing new life into the world, which is a really hard thing to get your head around, and really, really sad. Parents and other carers are feeling scared for their children and grandchildren. People impacted by climate disasters are obviously going to be at higher risk. PTSD, alcohol and other drugs and so on, depression, suicide, and often for months and months after events, and especially in areas which are predicted to have ongoing extreme weather events. Climate scientists, I know of some people who have become really depressed through their work, and I can't even imagine to spend decade after decade learning about things and trying to sound the alarm and people not listening. And I know people who have gone to meeting after meeting over decades to our government, different state and federal governments, and just really not been taken seriously. Activists, climate activists, of which I like to think of myself as proudly as one, get really tired and frustrated, and I think sometimes just feel really annoyed. That's like, why aren't more people concerned? Why aren't more people thinking about this on a daily basis? It really matters, and it's going to impact their lives, now and in the future. And obviously, other humans who are paying attention. I guess that I think there was one other group that Indigenous people tend to be particularly at risk. And a lot of that, I think, is around like connection to country and also living in areas like, say, Torres Strait and so forth, where they're more susceptible they're more vulnerable to climate change. People in rural and remote communities um, are more at risk of increased risk of mental health, the impacts of climate change, and then they have lower levels of funding and resources and so forth. So getting care is going to be harder. Frontline emergency service workers, firefighters, police, ambulance, state emergency services, and so forth. And yeah, so climate change is increasing the frequency and the intensity of exposures of this group. So lots of people, basically. And I guess this idea that most Australians actually are really concerned about climate change. So if you go online, which can be a scary place sometimes, you might get the sense that actually not many people are that worried, or there's lots of people who aren't worried. I believe it's like something like 80% of Australians are quite concerned. And what you're often seeing in those online spaces is lots of bots. And you're also seeing, unfortunately, people who get paid by the fossil fuel industry to, basically make dramatic statements about climate change not being real and so forth. Um, I think it really is a sense of betrayal that many people do feel increasingly. And I guess as more and more events happen, it's in the news cycle more frequently. So as I've been saying, this is a really great document that you might want to look up. Highly recommend it if you go to the Doctors for the Environment Australia website. You can really easily find, I think I found it under resources or something simple because someone had talked about it online today. So impacts on mental health. So I think we really want to I think the number one point is probably that first point there is understandable and congruent response to the scale of the crisis. So if a patient comes into you and they start talking about being really anxious and worried about climate change, I think, unfortunately, there have been times in the past where I've had friends and clients tell me that the response they got was quite negative, or it was sort of implied that they were a bit of they were catastrophizing, or that they didn't know what they were talking about, or they were really it was treated as though it was an anxiety disorder. And I would really, really encourage you to not do that because that can actually be really unhelpful when someone comes to they're trying to find somewhere to go to get support. They might be having sleepless nights, or they might be finding that they're increasingly worried about things or not wanting to watch the news. And the most important thing, I think, is really to validate that it's understandable, and you're really pleased that they've shared that with you. So that impacts on, day-to-day functioning, sleep, worry, mood, concentration, as well as plans for the future. Um, and obviously, this is going to be a big range. So you might have minimal stress that people have. You might have some people where it's like really fleeting at the time of like severe thunderstorms, for instance, or when there's talk on the news about there being flooding or bushfires and so on. So you might find some people who just have this episodic kind of increase in symptoms and stress and so on. It's still great if they come in and talk to you about it, and to be able to have that as a conversation. But then obviously there will be people who are going to, it's more of an issue that is maybe affecting their day-to-day life over time. Um, so there are going to be some people who are particularly vulnerable to extreme weather events and extreme heat. And there's lots of research in terms of just the medical. Actually, there's some good stuff in here about physical impacts. So, heart disease, stroke, worsening of neurological diseases such as MS. Air pollution is obviously an issue. Things like increased asthma, um, risk of complications during pregnancy, and so on. I think I remember going to a protest years ago, and I was like, babies can't breathe at 50 degrees. And I just think of, like, when it's a hot day, like no one wants to be outside, and it's nicer to be indoors. But obviously there's lots of ways that, like when you've got young kids, like often getting out for a walk in a stroller is the best way to get them to sleep. And it really does impact our day-to-day life. And things like, sports people who, aren't able to train or aren't able to be outside, as well as all of our young people who might play netball, soccer, whatever, and so many things because of rain and well, mostly rain, but also at times because of smoke and so forth, are not able to play. Um, okay, I think we've sort of covered those things. So, I'd just ask, maybe what you could do is just to take a moment, and if people do have, like, it's probably less of a question and maybe more of a reflection. And Kylie, maybe if there's any reflections that people would like to share, this might be a nice time. But really just thinking about what you've personally experienced and noticed about the changing planet, um, and or what have patients or clients shared with you, or it might have been family members. It may not have even been a patient. It might have been one of your kids, or it might have been, your sister or your aunt. It could have been someone else in your life. And I guess just that sense of how prepared you were to support yourself or someone else in that situation, or if you actually felt unprepared. So I guess in allied health, and no doubt as a GP as well, but there are things that are harder to talk about in our practice. So it might be things like sex, or asking people about their drug use, or there's just things that are maybe more tricky to kind of conversations to have. And so I'm wondering if people have raised things and it's like, oh, I felt really unprepared, or actually that brought up some stuff with me. And maybe if there's any reflections, just pop it in the chat, in the Q&A, and Kylie, let me know if there's anything there. Take a minute to have a think and reflect. Any comments that are coming through, Kylie?
Nothing's come through yet, Louise.
Okay, yeah, no worries. I hope that people have taken a minute and because it's easy in these moments to maybe want to check your phone and check your emails and whatever. But I would really encourage you to have a reflection of this at some stage because it's such an important thing to think about rather than just, the next time someone walks into your surgery that you're like, oh, wow, wasn't really expecting that, wasn't prepared for that. But hopefully after tonight you feel a bit more prepared anyway. All right, we'll move on. This is actually me, I think around age 12, actually, dressed up for a party. But I'd like you to, as we reflect on these next few things, again, just take 30 seconds just to reflect on a time when you felt really seen and you felt really validated. You felt like maybe an adult or it might have been an older teen or so forth, but someone really understood you and was there for you. And whilst you may, I want you to think about what the qualities were that they brought to that situation. Was it that they listened? Was it that they just really gave you the space to feel whatever you had? Was it that they guided you? But just take a moment and reflect. And again, if anyone wanted to put something in the Q&A, feel free to, because I really want you to think about what it feels like to be heard and understood when you're facing something that feels really overwhelming and challenging. I think I'm going to keep moving. You're a very quiet bunch tonight, which is totally fine. Alrighty. Okay, so what do people need from a therapist or a GP or a caring grown up? But most of you are here in some kind of clinical role, not all, but I guess we just want to think a little bit about what people might need. Um, so this actually comes from I asked quite a few people in a group that I belong to called Parents for Climate, and these were some of the answers I got that I thought were really helpful. People want a genuine acceptance that the threat is real, um, that they're worried about people like a professional downplaying the realities, um, hope for validation, and also just a basic understanding of the climate crisis. It's hard to know everything, but I was a bit perturbed when I saw a psychologist who didn't know anything about it. Um, I went to speak to a professional. Um, they said that their opinion was that global society has the ability to learn and to adapt in time. So a bit of a more of a reassurance kind of response, which in the right context might be helpful, but not particularly in that moment. Um, Am I crazy? I felt lonely and crazy keeping my climate anxiety to myself. It would be helpful to, like, I guess, to have that sense of it being normalized and destigmatizing the experiencing, and also that a professional would like recommend groups or, places where they could go and maybe find other people who are also concerned about climate change. I think acknowledging the fear and grief associated with climate change is important, and tips to do something proactive for the world can help to fight the existential fear. Okay. All right. I think, yeah, look, there's a lot of things that you can do, and I'm just going to touch on a few. Okay. I think probably the number one thing, especially in a short interaction, obviously, if you've got a patient who comes back, regularly, this might be something that you can have a conversation over time. But I think curiosity is probably going to be your best friend. It's really being able to just listen and actually don't say a lot at first, perhaps. You just want to understand, ask them to tell you more and allow some pauses so that you can really get a sense of what is this person worried about, why are they raising it with you, and you might be then working out how much of it might be you know, things like their sleep, like physical symptoms, or how much of it might be more cognitive, and really just trying to work out what's going on. Really resisting the urge to solve it and fix it or medicate it. It might be that they do need some solutions, and it might be that they do need some medication. But I think that it's a little bit like if you think about someone coming to see you for bereavement as opposed to depression. We don't want to medicate someone because they're grieving, because it's a really natural and a healthy human process. In the same way, if people are experiencing anxiety when there is stuff going on that's really anxiety provoking, we want to really normalize and validate before we do much else. They're a healthy response. um, I say that there's no shame in not knowing, because if you've got someone coming in, let's say they're a climate activist or a climate scientist, or they work in the renewables energy space or whatever it might be, there's every possibility that they're going to know far more about this topic than you do. And that's a pretty uncomfortable position to be in our field. We like to know things, and we like to have a bit of expertise. So I think there's a little bit of kind of humility that we need to potentially show, that we may not know as much as them. And what they're saying might seem very dramatic or catastrophic, or, like that they're exaggerating. But unless you've actually done quite a lot of reading in this area, it may not be actually, unfortunately, because what we see in the media tends to be pretty high level and often glosses over some of the more disturbing kind of facts and figures. And also resisting the urge to defend or to feel like we're supposed to have the answers and so on. And I think really what you're trying to do is just to be curious and ask them how they're feeling about things. So that's really, I think, going to be, might seem like very little, but actually might be the best conversation that you could have. And they go away feeling like, my doctor cares, or my doctor's interested, or my therapist was open to listening to what I had to say and didn't try and challenge my thoughts in this first conversation. That's not to say you would never challenge the thoughts, or never teach them other kind of strategies like diffusion and so forth. But you really want to have a good picture of whether that's something that's necessary, or whether you're better off actually getting them doing things rather than trying to change their thoughts. When in doubt, listen and validate. Okay, I think that's really just a summary. Yeah, I think things like, what do you need from me? How can I best support you with this? If you do have suggestions, I just suggest that you ask permission. Something I learned from a parenting expert that I really like is just this idea of when kids come to us with things, especially when they're telling us something that might be very hard, or they might be worried they're in trouble, or they may not be understood, is the first thing we tell them is that we're so pleased that they've shared this with us. Thank you so much for telling me. And I think if you can give the professional version of that, I think that's awesome. Just that you're really, really pleased that they've brought this to your attention. Just a pretty, another Jess Harwood art. So I guess a lot of what is important when we're talking about climate change is about not being hopeful, but actually active in hope. So, being the change you want to see. Um, and it's things like actually getting people doing things. So often when we're dealing with anxiety that might be, out of proportion to a situation, like someone who's really terrified of catching planes or of germs or whatever it may be, we might want to actually do things very differently. Whereas actually there's a lot of great research that suggests that when it comes to climate anxiety, doing things will probably help with the anxiety. It's not going to change dramatically what might be happening around them, but it makes them feel less hopeless and helpless and frustrated and so on. I really think this is important, that we start where we are and you do something, and the sooner the better. So I might say to a client, what about, something that you could do in the next 24 hours that feels like it's in line with your values? When I first became really aware of climate change and just how bad things were was ironically at a conference in Dublin in 2019. And I spent 2 hours in a workshop just crying and crying, and quite a few sort of sleepless nights actually afterwards in the weeks when I got home. But the first thing I did when I got home was I went and bought a worm farm. Small thing, but it just felt like something I could do. One of the pictures there is of my then 9-year-old who put together a book of poems and letters, and we sent them off to the Prime Minister, amongst others, to let them know that kids and parents were really worried about what was happening, and we wanted them to respond. A question that I love, what would future me wish I had done right now? Would be a great one to share with your patient, your client, for yourself. You know, what would future me wish I had done right now? And it's a really nice way of bringing our values into what we do. I know that I think we're stopping around 1:45 to do some questions. So I'm just going to whiz through a couple more of these slides. So we want to really focus in on values as a really, really key part. And I think some of the conversations, whether it be like, it might be quite different if it's a GP session or whether it's a more counselling session. But things like, you know, reminding them of the time when they've made a difference and what that was like and what they were able to do. Asking your patient like what they want to stand for, how they would feel proud of themselves. Um, you know, like what could they bring to this that might mean that they feel a bit less helpless, or that might help them with their anxiety. With some people, that last point is going to be really important. So, is a break or pulling back required? Because for many people, there will be a risk of burnout. And so, we want to make sure that they actually, rather than do more, we want to actually check in and make sure that they're not doing too much. And maybe that they can actually take a break while other singers in the choir can come in and take their part. Mindfulness strategies, I'm going to assume that everyone's familiar with, but you know, the sort of things that you can be thinking of is like people who might be having thoughts or images about things that might happen down the track, that sort of pre-TSD, so to speak. So things like I'm noticing a scary image from the future. So helping people to stand back and to get a little bit of distance from what they're experiencing in their thoughts or their images. Making room for their emotions, and really that, you know, right now I'm having this feeling, grounding in the present moment. And also, like for people who are familiar with ACT, this will be something you're familiar with, but noticing stories that we get hooked by. Um, Also, again, the very sort of ACT kind of concept of willingness to face grief and loss so that a new future is possible. So it's very easy to focus on the negatives and the worries and the concerns about climate change, but we also want to ask people maybe what are the things that might be positive, or the actions that might be positive. So one thing, for instance, a key action that people can take is to get involved in community, whether that be chatting to your neighbours, or whether it be starting a, you know, community garden or those sorts of things. So that might actually be one of the positive things that comes out of world events and you know, things like existential threats like climate change. Um, just in terms of sort of caring for yourself and compassion and what you can teach your patients is kind of like there might be times when things come up that it's not quite the right time. This is something I used to work in oncology and hematology a long time ago, and I'd have, you know, conversations that were really hard and upsetting. And then I'd have to go in and see another patient. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this kind of thing. So just this idea of like noticing what's showing up, acknowledging that it's there. And maybe it's like, yeah, maybe you can sit down with that later. Like it sounds like the stuff that you're feeling really sad about or you're feeling really worried about. Maybe when you get home, you could sit down and write a bit about that. Or maybe you could draw if drawing something that you like doing. I also really suggest to people that that they don't have to read all of the climate science news. I have some friends and I belong in groups where there's just lots and lots of information and it can be quite overwhelming. So I would suggest that if you've got a patient who is really very engaged in the climate space, environmental issues, maybe just asking them about like, do they ever allow themselves to have a bit of a break? And I think if you are asking those sorts of questions, um, sometimes I hear people will say things like, oh, I don't want to watch the news, it's too depressing. And I think if you say that to someone who's really engaged in political or in climate and environmental issues, that might feel a bit dismissive. So I think just a way to be able to say, I can see it's really important to you to stay up to date with what's going on. And it sounds like you're really engaged in this and you care deeply. Um, I would really, again, strongly suggest you don't use the word passionate. There's a bit of a joke in climate circles. It's like, yeah, I'm really passionate about the survival of our species on this planet. In the same way, I'm passionate about knitting or going to the movies. So passionate is probably not a great word, but that you deeply care or you're deeply concerned, I think, may be a better terms. But just, I think it's important that people know that it's okay to deeply care about something and also do things that might be frivolous and silly and fun, like to watch a great film or to go for a laugh and things like that, that if it's always really heavy, it's probably not going to be great for their mind. Um, do interrupt me, Kylie or Brendan, if you want me to stop, or should I go for a couple more minutes? I'm actually pretty close to a
Um,
place where I can end, or do you want to stop now?
no, keep going, Louise. There aren't any questions in the chat at the moment, so
Okay.
keep going. And if we can just ask everyone if they do have any questions, pop them in the chat, and we can ask them when you wrap up. But please
Awesome.
continue. Take your time.
Yeah, okay, great. Please, if you do have questions, pop them in. I, would love to answer any sort of specific questions. But until they appear, maybe I'll keep going, or until Kylie or Brendan tells me otherwise. Okay. Um, so these are just things that you might ask a patient to do, like just to do some journaling, and they might even think about things that drain or demoralize or exhaust them, things that nourish and energize them. Asking themselves, like, why am I doing this? Like, reconnecting with their values, also thinking about what they're grateful for. This comes from a book called Active Hope, which is a really beautiful book. And actually, sadly, Joanna Macy died only a few weeks ago. A really, really amazing woman in this space who I really encourage you to look out for some podcasts and things that she's interviewed in. Very inspiring person. So I guess, what you might be encouraging people to do is, how can you look after yourself? This is clearly really important to you. You care deeply about it. What, in order to be able to do that work, or in order to be able to, to keep doing your day-to-day commitments and so forth, how can you then look after yourself? If you are getting the sense that this is really impacting on, the amount of worry that they're experiencing or their sleep or whatever it may be. So making sure that there's a bit of balance in their life. Um, I guess some of this stuff is maybe more about like connecting with people who like want to do more, but maybe they're not sure how to, or they might think that they can't make a difference. And maybe it's also for people who aren't doing enough, but just these ideas of like feeling proud of yourself at a future point, imagining a future that we want for future generations. Even things like imagining, um, so let's say that a person might have youngish children. You might say, could you imagine, and they might be really worried about those children's futures. You might say, could you imagine like maybe sitting down with them in 10 years time and having a conversation, and they ask you like, well, mum, what did you do? Or dad, what did you do when you found out that things weren't going so well? And, imagine having that conversation and feeling proud that you had done what you could for your kids. So if a parent is feeling overwhelmed or feeling helpless, hopeless, feeling like they can't make a difference, sorry, I just got a jump scare from my puppy, then it might be that you're able to kind of really get them to think about what they want to stand for in the midst of this crisis, or these polycrises as they're often referred to. Okay. Couple of quick dilemmas that might come up. I do think that if you're going to be working with someone who has some significant anxiety or grief, or say has been through extreme weather events and maybe has some PTSD symptoms and so forth, I do think you need to have done at least a bit of your own work around your own feelings, just because it's, really to empathize and to put yourself in their shoes, because it might be really hard to understand, what it's like for people unless you've got some sort of sense of how it is, and also to prevent you getting into a position where you might then um, be a bit defensive or may share information that's really not actually fact-based, science-based, and so forth. Um, I think the self-disclosure stuff is important. So I generally think, so I give an example here, like if someone says that they're really, really scared about climate change, I think saying something like, I'm scared too, thanks so much for sharing that. I can relate to that, though we might really experience this in different ways. So I'm really interested to find out how this shows up for you. So I guess in a way, it's a little bit of a me too. I also am scared, like the 80% or so of Australians who are, so that the person doesn't feel alone or feel like they're in a minority for caring about this stuff. But that in a sense, it's like we're not going to talk about me and my woes. Now, it looks like there might be some questions popping in. I haven't seen them, but Kylie or Brendan, I'm happy to stop there and answer some questions. And then the only other stuff I've really got is some resources and things which people will see when I send through the handout.
There aren't any questions at the
Oh, okay.
moment, but I have a question for you, Louise.
Okay, perfect.
And thanks so much as well. It's just been a really powerful presentation and just a lot of the impacts of climate change that I think we all identify with personally, and yeah, very practical approach of how to discuss this sensitive topic with clients. But I was just wondering what gives you hope in this field? So either in terms of climate action or mental health.
Yeah, wow. It would really depend on what day you catch me, to be honest, I think, Kylie. And I think that that's probably how a lot of people feel. So right now, for instance, there's the EPBC Act is being reviewed. Some of you might know it's the environmental nature laws. And at the moment, they're looking like they're being really going to be watered down so that they're good for fossil fuel industry, not so good for other humans. So that's not answering your question. What gives me hope is the millions of amazing people around the world all playing their part, all coming together because they care deeply about all sorts of parts of climate. So for some, it might be they care a lot about water and access to clean water. Others might be really focused in on renewable energy. Others might be really focused in on community building. Others are really focused in on agriculture and, eating more plants and things. So that gives me hope. Also, I guess I would say, just because I've been a part of the community independence movement, that gives me hope. It's like our democracy being shared, and there being more voices coming into our government spaces, because the science is all there, the solutions are all there. It's unfortunately it's political will that's the problem. So that really is what's holding us back. So I guess that gives me hope that more and more people are getting engaged. I have people sometimes say things to me like, "Oh, I've been eating lots more plants," and I know that's because they know that I decided to go vegan maybe 4 years ago. And so I love seeing that kind of domino effect. And when people talk more about this stuff and they start speaking positively about the changes, or they get solar panels on their roof or whatever it may be, that does have a positive effect on others around them. So yeah, I guess that's what gives me hope. And young people, like, oh, so much energy and enthusiasm to, just to get on with it and make a better future for themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you, Louise. And there are actually a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll just read them out. The first one is, um, what do you think we as health professionals and health organisations should be doing with respect to climate advocacy regarding the impacts we are witnessing on our patients?
Oh, in terms of climate advocacy, okay. So I think probably, I mean, there are some great groups out there. So I would say probably either joining those groups or supporting those groups, amplifying those voices. So Doctors for the Environment Australia does some really great work. Psychology for a Safe Climate is another one. Let me think. I mean, they're probably the two that I immediately think of in Australia. And it might be, who else is here that I've got? Others are sort of more overseas. Um, Parents for Climate is not that's not so much in terms of health, but they would be the two main ones in terms of health. The Climate Council would be another group to sort of really support. I mean, also, I think, sometimes it might be, just speaking with the management of organisations and just letting them know that this is something that you would like to see at conferences and things like that. So I guess it's just getting the word out there and making sure that colleagues know that it's important and that you want to talk about it. And I guess also for clients and patients in terms of advocacy, I guess it's probably meeting with your MP, even if you think they're quite a good one, or like even if you think that they, like, let's say you've got a Greens MP who's all across this stuff and is going to be very, much more knowledgeable than some others. It might still be that they need to see that they've got support there, or they may not know about the particular concerns. Like if you've got a long-term patient who's got chronic use of antipsychotics, might be really struggling in heat, might be quite isolated in the community, and so on and so forth, doesn't have access to air conditioning and all those sorts of things. Those sorts of stories, I think, are really good to share with your local MPs so that they know, and that it basically MPs, governments do stuff when they get enough noise. And at the moment, there's just not nearly enough noise. Not enough people are, shouting at them, politely shouting at them. I hope that answers
Hi,
that question.
hi, Louise, it's Brendan here. I'm out walking in the back streets of Paddington here, but let me ask you a question, which is, what about the issue about social prescribing? The benefits of social prescribing, that is, of encouraging people to spend a bit of time outdoors, in the forests, on the beaches.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually one of the things that I'm sending you, I think, yeah, so the APS has a resource called Activate, which has got some really good strategies in there. And one of the ones there is engage with nature. Absolutely. I mean, for so many reasons, we know from physical and mental health, getting outside. But I think, if we can incorporate that into like some kind of brief mindfulness exercise or something. I mean, I think sometimes it's as simple as looking up at a tree when you're going out for a walk, stopping first perhaps so you don't fall over, trip over, which I would do. But, just really simple things like getting outdoors, but maybe also that sense of really actually connecting in a space. One of my colleagues in New Zealand was horrified when he came out to a conference a few years ago. He's like, Australians, other than First Nations people, just really don't have much connection to country. And so I think, that is actually, unfortunately, seems to me quite true. So any way that we can encourage people to just get out and yeah, walk in nature and tell them about the benefits of forest bathing and so on. You might, just give them a couple of, I think there's some really nice sort of facts that you can share with them so that they know that it's actually good for them.
Absolutely. Thanks, Louise. And there's just one more question in the chat, and then we've got 1 minute to wrap it up. So maybe if we just do this and then talk through the resources, Louise. But it's is not fighting for climate justice the best therapy for patient and healthcare worker alike?
Totally. Yeah, that's a rhetorical question, I would say. Yeah, like I think, and you know, there's so much, I guess, in medicine and psychology that is very individually based and all about what's happening in the individual. And I think the more that we can think about, you know, systems and context, and you know, and not you know, not blaming the person, but looking at, you know, why is this happening and what can we do about it? And that's why, you know, the kind of actions are going to be things like, well, you know, actually I've got sitting here somewhere, I've got this, it's actually for a different reason I won't go into, but I don't know if you can see that, but you probably know what WTF stands for. And it's like, can I control? Like, what can I control? And I think when we work with people around that, it's like, well, all of this stuff is happening and some of it we can't control. But people are far more powerful than they think they are. And like, that's where like a phone call to an MP or things like that is actually, you know, they work for us, not the other way around. So I think it's really, you know, well, they work for us, and yet we treat them almost like that, oh gosh, I couldn't really make that call, or I'd feel nervous or whatever. It's like, no, make that call. You know, talk to people about like getting solar panels in buildings that currently can't, because that's social housing, and you know, we need to really agitate for those things so that it's not just wealthy people who can afford to really adapt to climate change. We need it to be everyone to be able to come along for the journey. Yes.
Thanks, Louise. That really resonates with me, and hopefully everyone else here, that, you know, little efforts, you know, little things we do actually collectively make a big difference.
Totally. We are much more powerful than we think.
Mm.
I think that, you know, other than showing you, but look, there's some links to, and I might actually send that to you as a separate slide so people can actually use the links rather than as a PDF. And yeah, so resources, I think they will all be self-explanatory. So by all means, I don't want to keep people longer than you've advertised, but there's loads of great resources. And, you know, some of the simplest things we can do is actually just share stuff with our family and friends in WhatsApp groups and on Facebook and Instagram, because that way it's like, I care about this thing and I'm open about it. For too long, unfortunately, climate change was something that we would almost, you know, didn't think we could talk about in this country. And that just needs to keep changing. We need to talk more and more about it. So thank you. I think, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Louise. Yeah, that was really motivating and moving presentation, and I'm sure everyone else really enjoyed it too. So thank you, a big thank you for coming along and speaking to us tonight.
Such a pleasure.
And just a reminder to everyone online to complete the evaluation survey, and we really appreciate your feedback and support, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Take care.